What if the initial kings didn't emerge from tribes or conquests, but descended from the skies? What if prior to the start of written history, before the deluge wiped out the world, 8 entities governed from a pyramid of unending fire for a period so immense it overshadows all documented eras? This isn't a myth murmured in darkness. It's etched into the most ancient Sumerian tablets, the Sumerian king list, naming them one by one: Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzid, Ensipadzidana, Enmenurana, and Ubaratutu. 8 undying rulers, each tenure gauged not in decades, not in centuries, but in tens of thousands of years, collectively 241 years, a duration that surpasses every empire, every dynasty, every society we recognize. And then abruptly the account halts. One phrase concludes it all. Then the flood swept over. How could those early scribes inscribe such improbable figures with such accuracy? Were these actually kings or something much more ancient? The Anunnaki, those who descended from the heavens. And if their governance was genuine, what did they bequeath? Not merely in remnants, but within us. Tonight we reveal the ziggurat of flame. We stroll amid the 8 statues that protect its foundation, their visages eternally oriented toward constellations that replicate their arrangements flawlessly. We enter the era preceding the flood, and we pose the prohibited inquiry. Did humanity once exist under the dominion of gods? Before pyramids ascended, before cities inscribed names into clay, there were kings, not kings as we comprehend them now, mortal men seizing power, but beings reputed to govern for cycles so extended that the stars themselves finished their orbits above them. The Sumerian tablets commence with this assertion. When kingship came down from heaven, it was in Eridu, a declaration both straightforward and astounding, an assertion that rulership was not created, but bestowed. This is where our narrative starts, with a finding that ought not to exist. In the arid shadows of ancient Mesopotamia, excavators unearthed something that challenges every chronology we've built. A pyramid scorched black by fire and ages, partially entombed under centuries of sand. But this was no typical relic. At its peak, a flame persists. Encircling it stand 8 statues sculpted with an accuracy that exceeds even the artistry of Egypt's old kingdom. Each form gazes outward, forever watchful, their stone gazes locked on the horizon, and when darkness descends, the enigma intensifies. The constellations overhead create the identical configuration, as if the stars were positioned to venerate these obscured sovereigns. The pyramid is modest by Egyptian measures, its foundation barely broader than a temple courtyard. Yet the engravings that coil up its flanks narrate a tale that outstrips all known history. Wedge-shaped cuneiform impressed into basalt that has endured millennia of weathering lists the names of 8 kings and the astonishing durations of their rules. 800 years for Alulim, 36,000 years for Alalgar, 200 years for Enmenluana. To the contemporary intellect, these figures are ridiculous. No human can endure so long. No lineage can extend across such astronomical intervals. And yet the identical tablets that document these implausible reigns also catalog kings who followed the flood, kings whose tenures are quantified in mortal decades, kings we can authenticate through digs and cross-references with other antique writings. If the subsequent portion of the record is reliable, if post-flood rulers like the dynasty founders can be verified with our tools and methods, why should we reject what preceded? This is the contradiction that resides at the core of the puzzle. Before the flood, kings with lifespans, beyond understanding. After the flood, kings constrained by human frailty. Between them, a solitary dividing boundary. Then, the flood swept over. Scholars naturally have proposed interpretations. They claim the initial kings are emblematic, that the numbers are allegories, cosmic rhythms, masked as human rules. But if that holds true, why are the digits so exact? Why do they correspond flawlessly with a unit the Sumerians termed the Sar, equal to 3,600 years, the basis of their whole mathematical framework? Alulim governed for 2,800 years, precisely 8 Sars. Algar governed for 36,000 years, precisely 10 Sars. Enmenluana governed for 43,200 years, precisely 12 Sars. The design is intentional. This is not lyrical overstatement. This is computation. And thus we confront a decision. To regard the record as metaphor, a shrewd fable from a people vanished 5,000 years ago, or to consider it earnestly, to inquire if there was truly an epoch before the flood when kingship was not mortal whatsoever. The Anunnaki, those who came from heaven, hover in the backdrop of this query. For certain investigators, the king list is not proof of legend, but proof of their inheritance. If kingship descended from heaven, was it actually passed down by entities who arrived in fire? If lifespans extended into tens of thousands of years, were these sovereigns truly human? Or were they something different, something greater, ruling in flesh yet unbound by our constraints of time? Ponder the similarities. Across the globe, societies recounted rulers who lived unimaginably long lives. In the Bible, the patriarchs before the flood endured for centuries. Adam for 930 years, Noah for 950. In Hindu lore, the Satya Yuga stretches for epochs beyond reckoning. In Egyptian king lists preserved at Abydos, divine sovereigns ruled for thousands of years before mortal pharaohs. Varied languages, varied territories, but the identical recollection. Before an immense flood, rulers existed in vast intervals of time. After the flood, life shortened. What transpired at that demarcation? Was there an alteration in the earth itself? A transformation in human physiology? Or was there merely a curtain pulled over recollection so that only pieces lingered, inscribed in myth and structure? As we embark on this exploration, we will proceed king by king, city by city, edifice by edifice. From Eridu, the initial city, where kingship descended, to the ziggurat of flame that linked heaven and earth. From the rule of Alulim to the ultimate admonition of Ubaratutu, who anticipated the waters and instructed his son to construct an ark. 8 names, 8 reigns totaling 241 years. But we will not halt there. Beyond the flood reside new kings, mortal durations, and the resonances that journeyed through time, evolving into the Neteru of Egypt, the Nephilim of the Bible, the Devas of India. Beyond the academics lie hypotheses that venture to propose the Anunnaki were tangible visitors from a planet named Nibiru, returning every 3,600 years to oversee their creation. And beyond all this resides the ziggurat itself, interred but not extinct, awaiting beneath the sands for the stars to realign once more, awaiting for the flame to rekindle, awaiting for the comeback of the kings who once positioned beneath a blazing sky and molded humanity in the likeness of the gods. This is the account of the era before the flood, the era of fire and starlight, the era when kingship descended from heaven and governed until the waters erased it all away, long before the archaeologists came with their brushes and cameras, long before the desert sands hid the truth beneath drifting dunes. There was a night when the sky itself ruptured open. Long before the archaeologists came with their brushes and cameras, long before the desert sands hid the truth beneath drifting dunes. There was a night when the sky itself ruptured open. Rewind. Not centuries, not millennia. Rewind to the brink of recollection itself. To a period before cities arose from plains, before the initial wedge was imprinted into damp clay, before humanity even possessed a term for king. The earth was fresher then, dimmer. The stars shone with a sharpness we can no longer perceive through the haze of our electric era. And on one of those primeval nights, beneath those unfamiliar star patterns, the heavens ripped apart. It commenced as thunder without clouds, a noise that echoed across the wilds like the voice of creation itself, vibrating through rock and bone equally. The sparse tribes of early humans, hunters, gatherers, beings who had only recently mastered tending fire, gazed upward in dread and amazement. The sky was hemorrhaging light. From the rift in the heavens emerged vessels, not ships as we conceive them, but chariots, shapes of radiant geometry that glided with inconceivable elegance, trailing fire that did not devour, light that did not dazzle. Ancient writings from numerous cultures would subsequently label them vimanas, Merkabah, divine barges. The Sumerians, when they eventually mastered writing, would employ a simpler expression, the boats of heaven. 8 chariots, 8 paths of fire across the inky vastness of the pre-dawn sky. They descended not softly, but with the might of verdict. Where they contacted the earth, the ground quaked, mountains fractured, rivers altered their paths. The air itself kindled, transforming the night into a false midday that endured 7 heartbeats. And when the light ultimately faded, when the dust cleared and the charred earth cooled, they stood upon the plain. The 8. They were tall, taller than any human who had trodden before them. The earliest narratives, preserved in shards too impaired for full interpretation, depicted them as shining ones, beings whose skin mirrored light as if sculpted from polished bronze and moonstone. Their eyes contained depths that mortal eyes could not confront. When they shifted, the air around them shimmered with heat or power, or something for which no tongue yet existed. But they were not ethereal phantoms. They possessed mass. They had materiality. They left imprints in the sand, profound marks that would be unearthed millennia later, fossilized in rock, each print larger than a human skull. They inhaled, they conversed, and when they conversed, it was in thunder. "Here," the first one declared, his voice echoing not just in the air, but in the chests of every living creature within 100 miles. "Here we commence." The location they selected was unremarkable, an expanse of marshland where 2 rivers merged, forming fertile soil between water channels. The humans who observed the arrival would later christen it Eridu, the first city, the site where civilization originated. But birth is seldom mild. The 8 proceeded with intent. Each assumed a stance around the vacant plain, creating a pattern that would not be comprehended until astronomers millennia later charted the same arrangement in the stars overhead. They lifted their hands, or what seemed to be hands, and from their palms emerged light. Not the warm light of fire, but something cooler, more exact. It sliced through stone as if rock were liquid. It fused sand into glass. It molded the earth itself to their desire. Alalim positioned at the northern apex, the tallest, his aura emanating what the ancients would term knowledge. When he shifted, the very atoms appeared to organize in his path, generating order from disorder. Alalgar claimed the south, incarnation of law, his voice like iron forging iron, setting limits that even the elements dared not violate. To the east stood Enmenluana, whose core throbbed with creation. Where he trod, seeds erupted into growth. Water discovered roots through arid soil. Life itself seemed to hasten. Enmengalana seized the west, judgment embodied. His stare could assess the mass of a soul. His quiet could condemn or exonerate. Between them, at the cardinal points, stood the others. Dumuzid emanating renewal, the perpetual cycle of death and rebirth. Enzipadzi-Dana, guardian of equilibrium, guaranteeing no force dominated another. Enmenurana, lord of ascension, the link between earth and heaven. And finally, Ubaratutu, protector of preservation, the one who would recall when all others forgot. They did not address the humans who observed from the shadows, not yet. First, they had labor to finish. The building required 7 nights. The first night they cleared the terrain, eliminating every flaw, every irregularity, until the earth was smooth as polished obsidian. The second night they positioned the foundation stones, enormous blocks of basalt that seemed to appear from nothingness, each one engraved with symbols that glowed dimly in the gloom. The third night they erected the first level of the ziggurat, constructing upward in flawless mathematical ratio. The fourth, the second level, the fifth, the third. On the 6th night they installed the capstone, a crystal lattice unlike anything naturally occurring on Earth, its inner framework more intricate than any contemporary computer, yet seeming to the eye as plain stone. And on the 7th night they ignited the flame. It was not fire as humans comprehended it. It did not devour fuel. It did not smoke or waver or fade. When the 8 kings lifted their hands together toward the crystalline peak, the sky replied. The constellations above them, 8 star patterns, each matching one of the rulers, flared with abrupt fierceness. Beams of light, visible even in daylight, descended from the heavens and focused on the capstone. The pyramid kindled. The flame that erupted from its apex was white gold, eternal, a pillar of energy that joined the earth to something beyond the stellar vault. The 8 stood in a ring around their creation, and for the first time they spoke to the humans trembling in the obscurity beyond the light. "We are the custodians," their voices boomed as one. "We have arrived from the realm beyond the waters of space, from the world you will name Nibiru. We are the Anunnaki, those who from heaven came to earth." The humans prostrated themselves, unable to grasp, scarcely able to respire in the presence of such might. "Your species has been selected," the voice persisted, issuing from all 8 at once, as if they shared a unified awareness. "You will be molded, uplifted, transformed into vessels of divine intent. From you will emerge those who bear our light into the epochs. From you will arise civilization, knowledge, order. You will learn to construct, to quantify, to document, to recall. This is our pact with you. We will govern, we will direct, we will safeguard you from the darkness that engulfs lesser worlds, and in exchange, you will revere us, you will remember us, you will sustain the flame." The pyramid blazed more intensely, and around its foundation the 8 kings planted standards, markers of authority, technological apparatuses disguised as ritual staffs. Where each standard touched the soil, the ground itself altered, becoming firmer, darker, more enduring. The perimeter of the first city was defined. Within that perimeter, humans would be shielded, instructed, changed. Beyond it, the old world would persist, wild, untamed, overlooked. The cities cleared. All of humanity assembled on the plains surrounding Eridu, prohibited from nearing but ordered to witness. And as the sun set and the stars appeared, The 8 kings assumed their positions. Each stood before one of the statues, ringing the ziggurat's base, depictions of themselves sculpted with impossible exactness, their stone eyes fixed on their matching constellations. Alulim to the north, Alalgar to the south, the others at their cardinal and ordinal points, forming a perfect octagon around the eternal flame. As the stars rotated overhead, the constellations shifted into alignment. One by one, they secured into place, and one by one, the 8 kings began to radiate. The light issued from within them, as if their bodies were merely containers holding something far brighter. The radiance strengthened until they appeared as figures of pure brilliance, their features melting into splendor. And as they blazed, the flame above them reacted. It grew taller, brighter, more fierce. The column of fire that normally ascended 50 feet into the sky expanded to 500, then 5,000. It penetrated the atmosphere itself, becoming visible from distant horizons, a signal that linked the ziggurat's summit to something beyond the stellar vault. The connection was forged. Through that pillar of light and energy, information streamed, not words. The exchange was too immense, too complex for speech, knowledge, directives, updates on the grand endeavor the 8 had been tasked with. And from Earth, reports ascended. The condition of the genetic initiative called humanity, the advancement of civilization, the obstacles and intricacies of shaping a species from primate raw material into something that could one day aspire to the stars themselves. The mortals who observed these alignments from the remote planes could only depict it in terms their limited lexicon permitted. The gods conversing with heaven, the kings communing with their forebears, the flame extending back to the domain from which kingship descended. They were not wholly incorrect, but they did not comprehend the peril. The initial disturbance happened in the 241st millennium of the reign, a date noted with precision because the priest astronomers had by then mastered measuring time with the same accuracy as the 8 themselves. The ritual commenced, as it always had. The stars rotated into position. The 8 took their places. The flame began its rise. And then something altered. The constellation to the northwest, the pattern linked with Enmenurana, shifted, not gradually, not according to the slow precession the astronomers had mapped over millennia, suddenly, violently, as if the stars themselves had been jarred from their designated spots. The flame flickered for the first time since its kindling. The eternal fire of Eridu wavered. The column of light twisted, bent as if it were a cord being tugged in opposing directions. The 8 kings, blazing in their stances, felt the instability as physical agony, a sensation absent from their experience for eons. "Hold the formation!" Alulim's voice thundered across the plain, no longer fully his own, but fused with something vaster. "Do not fracture the circuit." But the constellations persisted in shifting, not all of them, just enough to disrupt the geometry. The flame roared, its pulse turning erratic. The rhythm that had been constant for millennia, now stuttering, accelerating, straining to sustain the connection. From beyond the stars came a sound, inaudible to mortal ears, but registered by every priest astronomer as pressure in their craniums, a vibration in their bones. It was a message, compressed and warped by the faltering conduit, but unmistakable in its core. They were returning. The flame blazed crimson for a single heartbeat, a hue it had never displayed before. The 8 kings staggered, their light fading, their link to the cosmos faltering. And then, with a noise like reality itself, rending, the column of fire extinguished. For the first time in 241,200 years, the ziggurat of Eridu stood dark against the night sky. The mortals cried out. The 8 staggered, their immortal forms abruptly frail, abruptly burdened by the weight of all the ages they had endured. And overhead, the constellations continued their slow, impossible drift, moving from their ordained positions. The covenant was fracturing. The technology bridging heaven and earth was failing. And from the darkness between the stars, something immense was returning, not in peace, but in judgment. The obscurity did not endure. 3 days after the flame extinguished, after the ziggurat stood cold and silent for the first time in memory, it rekindled, but incorrectly. The light that burst from the capstone was no longer the steady white-gold brilliance that had linked earth to heaven. It throbbed irregularly, cycling through colors without names. Crimson like tainted blood, violet like bruised sky, green like rot. The 8 kings did not convene in council, they splintered. In the northern temple of Eridu, Enmenloana stood before a gathering of mortal priests and uttered words that would shatter the age of gods. "They are coming to terminate us," he said, his luminous form dimmer than before, as if the failed connection had depleted something vital from him. "Not just us, humanity. The experiment has succeeded too effectively. You have become more than they planned, more than they can manage." The priests quivered, scarcely comprehending. "We have a choice," Enmenloana continued, his voice urgent in a way absent across all millennia. "We can ready you, impart the knowledge we have withheld, teach you to protect yourselves when the judges descend, or we can follow Alulim's demands, seal everything away, reduce you to simplicity, render you harmless again." Beside him, Dumuzid placed a hand on the elder king's shoulder, a gesture unthinkable in earlier eras. "Some of us did not come here to forge slaves," he said quietly. "We came to forge inheritors." But in the southern city of Bad Tabira, in the temple of metal and law, Alelgar addressed his own assembly with vastly different words. "They have forgotten their station," his iron voice echoed through the forge hall. "We raised them from the mud. We gave them fire, writing, bronze, order. And what do? They question, they aspire, they gaze at the stars and think they merit touching them." Alulim stood beside him, the eldest of the 8, his face hewn from something harder than stone. "The connection failed because the balance has been upset. Humanity was never intended to advance this far, this quickly. Some among us," his gaze bore weight across the miles toward Eridu, "have been too generous, have forgotten the warnings, have forgotten what occurs when a creation outstrips its creators." "We must restore order," Alelgar declared, "strip away what should never have been taught, return them to a level that can be safely governed. The judges will see that we have rectified the imbalance. The covenant can be restored." But order, once shattered, cannot be easily restored. The first strike fell on the road between Eridu and Bad Tabira. A caravan of merchants transporting bronze tools from Alalgar's forges to Enmenloana's scholars never reached its destination. Witnesses on both sides reported the same event: a flash of light that turned night into noon, a sound like reality itself, tearing, and then silence. When scouts arrived at the site, they found only glass, the sand fused into a crystalline crater, every living thing within it reduced to shadow and ash. No one claimed accountability, but everyone knew. The war between the gods had commenced. It was not waged with armies. Mortals were too sluggish, too delicate, too insignificant for conflicts between beings who warped physics to their will. It was waged with forces that ancient texts could only portray in metaphor: lightning without sound, fire that ascends, light that annihilates without heat. But they were not metaphors. The weapons the 8 kings turned upon each other were not blades or lances, but concentrated uses of the same cosmic energies that fueled the ziggurat, the same forces they had employed to build civilization. In the hands of immortals consumed by millennia of widening philosophical rifts, those forces became tools of unmaking. Enmengalana, who had overseen justice for eons, found himself compelled to select sides. He chose law, chose order, chose Alulim. His judgment, always measured and equitable, became absolute and merciless. Entire settlements declaring loyalty to Enmenloana's faction simply ceased to be, not destroyed, but erased, as if they had never existed. Ensipadsidana, keeper of balance, attempted desperately to intercede. He journeyed between the cities, pleading for reason, for compromise. But balance cannot persist when both sides believe they possess absolute truth. When he refused to choose, both sides branded him traitor. He was the first of the 8 to perish. The accounts are fragmentary, contradictory, penned by scribes too terrified for complete accuracy. But all concur on this: the sky above Larak tore open. Light poured down, not from the stars, but from nothingness, from the void between realities. Ensipadsidana stood at the center of that light, his arms extended wide, attempting to absorb forces meant to demolish the city he safeguarded. His body transformed to light, then to sound, then to something the scribes described as the color of absence, and then he was simply gone. The first immortal death in 241,200 years. The remaining 7 fell silent with shock. For 3 days, no attacks occurred, no weapons discharged. The cities held their breath, and then the sky itself began to wail. The flame of Eridu, already unstable, began to feed on the violence. With each weapon fired, with each deployment of cosmic force, energy seeped into the bronze and basalt network threading the ziggurat. The structure was designed to channel power from the stars to Earth. But now it drew power from the war itself, from the fracturing of reality each time the immortals clashed. It grew brighter and brighter and brighter still. Ubaratutu, who had stayed isolated in his tower of preservation throughout the conflict, emerged to find the flame visible from 100 miles away, a column of tormented light, pulsing with seizure-inducing ferocity. He ascended the ziggurat alone, climbing tier by tier, sensing the heat radiating from the bronze veins beneath the basalt. At the summit, before the crystalline capstone, he placed his hands on the stone and felt the feedback from the cosmic circuit. What he detected there made his blood, golden and luminous, run cold. The ziggurat was overloading. The forces it absorbed exceeded its design capacity. The crystal matrix at its core was fracturing under the strain, micro fissures spreading through its impossible geometry. And if it failed utterly, if it shattered, while still linked to reality's fabric, the explosion would rend the world in 2. He descended at a run and located the others, all 7, divided into factions but still bound by shared origin, gathered on the plains below. They had sensed it too. The building catastrophe, the nearing point of no return. "We have to shut it down," Ubaratutu gasped, his eternal poise finally broken. "All of us together now." "We can't," Enmenurana replied, his voice empty. "The connection to Nibiru remains active, damaged but active. If we sever it while they're mid-transit, they'll arrive to a dead world." "Then they'll arrive to a dead world," Ubaratutu shouted, "because that's what this will become if we don't act." But acting demanded unity, and unity demanded trust, and trust had been incinerated in their civil war's fires. On the horizon, another flash of light, another weapon discharged, another impossible force unleashed. The flame responded, flaring brighter, its pulse racing faster. Inside the ziggurat, the bronze veins began to glow red, then white, conducting more energy than ever intended. Humanity watched from their cities, their farms, their hiding places. They watched their gods, beings they had worshipped for longer than human memory could encompass, tear at each other and the world around them. They watched civilization, that precious gift taking millennia to build, crumble in days. Some prayed, some fled, some simply sat and awaited the end. And in the temple of Bad Tibira, Alulim made a decision. "If we cannot restore order," he said to Alalgar, his oldest ally, "then we will invoke the final protocol." Alalgar's eyes widened, the first sign of fear he had shown in ages. "You can't mean the cleansing?" "Yes." Alulim's voice was granite. "We will wipe it clean, return the world to its primordial state, begin again. Do it right this time." "That will kill them all," Dumuzid said from the doorway, where he had been eavesdropping. "Every human, everything we've built, everything we've taught." "Better that than what's coming," Alulim replied. But Dumuzid turned and ran, racing toward Eridu to warn Enmenluana, and the war, which had been terrible, became apocalyptic. Above them all, the ziggurat of Eridu burned brighter than the sun at noon, a beacon visible from beyond the atmosphere, announcing to anything observing from the cosmos that something on Earth had gone catastrophically wrong. The judges were coming, and they would arrive to find not the orderly experiment they had commanded, but a world tearing itself apart, ruled by fractured immortals, and populated by humans caught between gods at war. They arrived without forewarning, though in truth they had been approaching for years, traversing the vast dark between worlds at speeds that warped physics into new shapes. The sky did not rupture open, as it had when the Eight descended. There was no thunder, no chariots of fire trailing splendor across the atmosphere. Instead, the stars simply halted. Every point of light in the heavens froze mid-rotation, suspending the cosmic wheel that had turned ceaselessly since creation itself. And then the sky spoke. The voice was not sound, it was pressure, absolute, inescapable, pressing down on every living thing beneath the frozen stars. Mortals dropped to their knees, their minds unable to process the presence of something so immense it seemed to occupy multiple dimensions simultaneously. Even the Eight Kings, immortal and radiant, felt themselves shrinking, becoming small again, reminded that they were not creation's pinnacle, but merely its stewards. "Custodians of Earth," the presence declared, each word reverberating through matter and spirit alike. "You are summoned to account." From the motionless stars descended three forms, though forms is inadequate, for they were more concept than substance, more law than flesh. The ancient texts would call them the judges of the sky. Later cultures would name them watchers, archons, the celestial council. But names are just sounds humans make when faced with the incomprehensible. They were larger than the Eight, not in physical scale, but in presence, in existential weight. Where the kings emitted light, the judges seemed to absorb it, creating voids in reality around which the world had to flow. They assumed positions above the ziggurat, forming a triangle enclosing the blazing, unstable flame. The seven remaining kings, Ensipadzi-Dana already lost to the war, gathered at the pyramid's base, their factions forgotten, their conflicts rendered instantly irrelevant. Before absolute authority, rebellion becomes impossible. "The covenant is broken," the central judge proclaimed. "You were sent to guide. You have created chaos. You were sent to preserve order. You have waged war. You were sent to cultivate vessels for divine purpose. You have created rivals." Alulim stepped forward, his luminous form somehow lessened in his superior's presence. "We sought only to fulfill our mandate, to shape humanity according to the blueprint." "You exceeded the blueprint." The words fell like an executioner's blade. "Humanity has learned writing, mathematics, metallurgy, astronomy. They build monuments, they measure time, they question, they aspire, they look at the stars and believe themselves capable of reaching them. Is that not success?" Enmenluana's voice trembled with desperate hope. "We have elevated them beyond all initial projections. They are magnificent. They are dangerous." The middle judge shifted, and reality bent around the motion. Above them, the unstable flame of Eridu pulsed in sync with their words. "You were warned. The template allows for intelligence sufficient to serve, not to rival, awareness adequate for purpose, not for independence. You have created a species that mirrors your own trajectory, and you know where that trajectory leads." A pause heavy with implications the mortals could not grasp, but the kings understood all too well. "Your own makers learned this lesson, as did their makers before them. The pattern is ancient and absolute. Creation that rivals creator becomes either slave or successor. There is no third path." Then let them be successors, Dumuzid's voice rang with defiance bordering on suicide. Let humanity inherit what we have built. They deserve. You do not determine what they deserve. The finality in those words ended all argument. The kings have been divided, the covenant has been violated, the connection must be severed. The three judges raised what might have been arms, and from their forms came something that was not light, not darkness, but the absence of both, a null force that struck the ziggurat's capstone with soundless impact. The flame screamed. For the first time since its ignition, 241,000 years earlier, the eternal fire of Eridu experienced pain. The energy column twisted, writhed, as the link to Nibiru was forcibly ripped away. The bronze veins threading through the basalt pyramid began to crack, releasing energy in violent pulses. The constellations overhead, frozen until now, suddenly resumed motion, but distorted, displaced, as if the cosmic geometry itself had shattered. The 8 kings fell to their knees, hands clutching heads, bodies convulsing as their connection to the source was cut. The golden blood in their veins turned sluggish, cold. The light emanating from their skin began to dim. For the first time in their existence, they felt mortal. And then the flame went out. Total darkness. The ziggurat, which had blazed for longer than human civilization, stood silent and dead against the frozen stars. The only light came from the judges themselves, and that light was terrible to behold. "The kings are recalled," the central judge pronounced. "You will be taken to account before the highest court. Your stewardship is ended. Your reign is concluded." "And humanity?" The voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the silence. "What of them?" "The experiment is terminated." 3 words. An entire species condemned. "The world will be cleansed. The elevation will be reversed. Those who survive will forget. The record will be sealed beneath stone and sand. When the waters recede, humanity will begin again, as it was meant to be." "No." Ubaratutu stood, though the effort seemed to cost him dearly. "You cannot. We do not require your consent." And then Ubaratutu saw it. The vision struck him with physical force, driving him back to his knees. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and through those blank orbs poured images of a future not yet written, but already certain. The sky darkening with clouds reaching from horizon to horizon. Rain falling not in drops, but in walls. Rivers overflowing banks, merging into inland seas. Seas rising to swallow coasts. Mountains becoming islands, islands vanishing beneath churning foam. The ziggurat, this ancient monument to a failed age, submerged beneath waters that would not recede for generations. Cities swept away, civilizations erased. The accumulated knowledge of 241,200 years dissolving like clay in rain. And humanity, most of it drowning. Millions of souls who had committed no crime except being too well educated, too aware, too human. When the vision released him, Ubaratutu was weeping. Golden tears streamed down his face, crystallizing before hitting the ground. "When?" he gasped. 7 years. Time enough to gather what is yours and depart. Time enough for those who pass judgment to arrive. Time enough for the cleansing to be prepared. The judges began to ascend, their work complete. Return to Nibiru, face your tribunal, accept your failure. The earth will continue without you. "Wait." Ubaratutu stumbled forward. 7 years. May I? The judges paused, perhaps curious about what a condemned custodian might request in his final moments of authority. "May I save a remnant? Not many, just enough to remember. To preserve some fragment of what we built here." Silence. Then, "The cleansing will spare those who float. We do not forbid vessels. We do not forbid preservation. But know this, what survives will be less. Humanity will forget its elevation. The memories will fade. The knowledge will be lost. You may preserve bodies. You cannot preserve what they have become." And then the judges were gone. ascending beyond the frozen stars, leaving the seven kings alone in the darkness beside their dead flame. Ubaratutu did not hesitate. He walked from the ziggurat directly to his son's dwelling in the city of Shurupak. Ziusudra was mortal, one of the hybrid line born between immortal kings and human mothers, carrying traces of both lineages in his blood. He had lived 400 years already and showed no signs of aging. Of all humanity, he was closest to understanding what his father truly was. Father. Ziusudra opened his door to find Ubaratutu standing there, diminished, darkened, his light almost entirely gone. "My son," Ubaratutu said, and his voice cracked with grief spanning eons, "I need you to build something. Build it large, build it strong, build it to float." A vessel for what? For everything that must survive. And there in the doorway, as the first unnatural clouds began to gather on the horizon, Ubaratutu told his son about the coming flood. Above them, the stars remained frozen for 3 more hours before finally, mercifully, resuming their eternal dance, but in new positions, marking a new age. The age of gods had ended. The age of survival was about to begin. 7 years is simultaneously an eternity and no time at all. For Ziusudra and the workers laboring beside him, 7 years meant every waking moment devoted to a single purpose, the vessel. They built it not on water, but on high ground, following specifications Ubaratutu provided, dimensions that seemed arbitrary until one realized they described ratios, proportions that would allow the structure to endure forces no ship had ever been designed to withstand. The vessel was not beautiful. It was a floating fortress, rectangular, massive, sealed with pitch both inside and out. 3 decks to separate species, compartments for provisions, systems for fresh water, but most importantly, a chamber at the very center, lined with bronze and stone, designed to house something more precious than life itself. While they built, the world continued. Humanity, unaware of its sentence, celebrated harvests and mourned deaths, waged small wars, and negotiated smaller pieces. The cities functioned. Trade routes remained open. Scribes continued impressing their wedges into clay, recording transactions and treaties that would never be read by future generations. The 8 kings, diminished and darkened, withdrew to their temples, some to pray, some to rage, some simply to wait for the end in silence. And the judges, having delivered their verdict, departed, returning to Nibiru, to the cosmic court, leaving Earth to the mechanisms they had set in motion. The sky knew first. It began on a morning that seemed ordinary. The sun rose. Farmers walked to their fields. But those who studied the heavens noticed something amiss. The clouds were moving against the wind. Formations that should have dispersed instead consolidated, drawing together from all horizons, converging on a point directly above the plains of Sumer. By midday, the sky had darkened to twilight. By evening, the first drops fell. They were not like normal rain. Each drop was too heavy, too cold, carrying a weight suggesting it had fallen from far higher than any earthly cloud. When they struck the ground, they left impressions, small craters in the dust that did not immediately absorb the water, but held it as if the earth itself refused what the sky offered. The priest astronomers checked their tablets, their star charts, their meticulously maintained records of weather patterns spanning millennia. Nothing in their archives predicted this. Nothing in their mathematical models allowed for it. And then the sky opened, and knowledge became irrelevant. The rain did not gradually intensify. It arrived fully formed, a complete system, as if an ocean suspended above the world had suddenly been released. It fell in sheets so thick that visibility collapsed to arm's length. It fell with such force that it stripped leaves from trees, eroded soil from hillsides, shattered clay roofs that had stood for centuries. But worse than the rain from above was the rain from below. The ground began to weep. Springs dry for generations suddenly burst forth. Wells overflowed, rivers swelled beyond their banks within hours, and from the deep places, from cracks in the earth unknown to exist, water surged upward, not fresh water of rain, but salt water, bitter water, water trapped beneath the crust since the world's formation. The firmament above and the deep below had been breached simultaneously. Ziusudra stood at the door of his completed vessel, watching the water rise around its base, and understood with terrible clarity that his father had not exaggerated. This was not a storm. This was the world returning to its primordial state, the separation of waters from land being reversed, creation itself running backward. "Everyone inside," he commanded, "now." The lowlands vanished first. Fields that had fed millions became lakes by sunrise. Villages evacuated to higher ground, carrying what they could, abandoning what they couldn't. But the higher ground was not high enough. The water rose 3 cubits per hour, a measurement the priest astronomers recorded with numb precision until their tablets were swept away. Cities surrounded by walls found the walls overtopped. Cities built on hills found the hills becoming islands. Cities built on islands found themselves submerged. And still the rain continued, hammering down with mechanical consistency, as if the sky had become a machine designed for drowning worlds. The vessel began to float. Ziusudra felt the moment the timber released from earth, the subtle shift as buoyancy overcame weight. Around him, in their separated compartments, animals made sounds of distress, cattle lowing, birds shrieking, creatures of every kind that his father had commanded him to preserve, creating a chorus of confusion and fear. In the central chamber, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed within 3 nested boxes of cedar, bronze, and gold, rested a small crystal no larger than a thumb, pulsing with faint, irregular light, the last spark of the flame of Eridu. Mountains became foothills, foothills became islands, islands became memories. The great pyramid of Eridu, which had stood dark and silent since the judges extinguished its flame, found itself surrounded by rising waters. The statues of the 8 kings, carved with impossible precision, having stood vigil for 241,200 years, disappeared one by one beneath the churning surface. But as the water touched the 7th tier, something extraordinary occurred. The flame reignited, not with its former glory, not with the white gold brilliance that had connected heaven and earth, but with a softer, sadder light, bronze and amber, the color of sunset, of endings. It rose from the capstone not as a column, but as a sphere, a bubble of luminescence that enclosed the pyramid's summit even as the water rose around it. The 8 kings, scattered across the drowning world, all turned toward Eridu at the same moment. They felt the pulse of their creation's final defiance, the structure refusing to die silently, asserting its purpose one last time, to be a beacon marking the threshold between ages. Some of the kings chose ascension. Alulim and Alalgar stood together in Batabira. As the waters reached their temple, they raised their faces to the storm-dark sky. And from the clouds descended pillars of light, pale, cold, nothing like the fire that had brought them to earth, but sufficient. Their bodies converted to energy, to information, to something that could survive the journey back to Nibiru without a vessel. They rose as streaming particles, as data compressed into light, vanishing into the heavens. Enmenluana and Enmenurana chose differently. They descended into the depths of their temples, into chambers prepared for exactly this purpose. They lay down in sarcophagi of crystal and bronze, their bodies already hardening, petrifying, becoming something between flesh and stone. The water would seal them, the silt would bury them, and perhaps in some distant age they would awaken. Dumuzid walked into the flood deliberately, choosing neither ascension nor entombment. He simply released, his body dispersing into the water like ink in wine, his essence distributing itself throughout the deluge, becoming part of the cycle of death and renewal he had embodied for so long. And Mengalana vanished without record, his final judgment applied to himself, the sentence executed in privacy. And Ubaratutu climbed. Day 7. The silence. The vessel drifted in an ocean with no shores. The rain still fell, but lighter now, as if exhaustion had finally claimed even the celestial machinery of destruction. Ziusudra stood on the deck, searching horizons that revealed nothing but water, sky meeting sky. Beneath the waves, how far beneath? He could only guess. The ziggurat of Eridu stood submerged, its flame still burning in its protective sphere. The light refracted and scattered by countless tons of water, visible from above as a soft golden glow in the depths. Ubaratutu had reached the summit before the water overtook it. He stood there now, inside the sphere of light, his hands on the crystal capstone, feeding it the last of his immortal essence to keep the flame alive just a little longer. His sun sailed somewhere above, carrying the spark that would preserve a memory of the fire. Below, the cities of humanity lay crushed beneath the weight of judgment. Around him, the light dimmed moment by moment as his life converted to illumination. When the flame finally extinguished for the second and final time, Ubaratutu's body remained, not dispersed, not ascended, not entombed elsewhere, but rooted there at the ziggurat's apex, his hands fused to the stone, his face turned upward toward a surface he could no longer see. The last king, the final guardian, preserved perfectly in the airless darkness, waiting for someone, someday, to find him. Above, the rain stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds sang because no trees remained above water for them to perch upon. No wind blew because the normal atmospheric patterns had been shattered. Even the lapping of waves seemed muted, as if the water itself was shocked by what it had accomplished. Ziusudra stood on his floating fortress, holding his son, barely 3 years old, born just before the flood began, and looked at the drowned world. Everything was gone. Everyone was gone. The accumulated knowledge of 241,200 years, the libraries and temples and workshops, the irrigation systems and astronomical observatories and metallurgical forges, all of it beneath an ocean stretching unbroken to every horizon. In his pocket, wrapped in oiled leather, the crystal spark pulsed weakly. 147 days the vessel would drift. 147 days before the waters would begin slowly to recede. 147 days of silence broken only by the sounds of animals and the quiet weeping of the last man who remembered the age before the flood. The world had ended, and in ending, it would begin again. The waters receded slowly, revealing a world made strange. Mountains that had stood in the north now rose in the east. Rivers carved new paths through landscapes reshaped by the weight of oceans. Forests that had taken millennia to grow were gone, replaced by plains of silt stretching to horizons, still adjusting to their new positions. The earth had been kneaded like clay, reformed, reset. When Ziusudra's vessel finally grounded on the peak of what would later be called Mount Ararat, he opened the door to a world that remembered nothing. The survivors who emerged, his family, the animals, the seeds and tools and scrolls he had preserved, stood on barren rock and looked down at a planet that had forgotten it was ever civilized. No roads, no cities, no fields of grain or orchards of fruit, just raw earth waiting to be claimed again by life that would have to start over. Almost. In Ziusudra's hands, wrapped in its triple boxes, the crystal spark still pulsed, faint but persistent. The last ember of the flame of Eridu, the last physical connection to an age when gods walked as kings and humanity learned from immortals. He built an altar on the mountaintop, not a temple. He lacked the knowledge, the materials, the workforce, just a simple pile of stones with the crystal placed at its center. And there he made a promise to his father, to the drowned world, to the future. I will remember. But memory, he would learn, is the most fragile thing humanity possesses. The first generation born after the flood listened to their grandfathers' stories with rapt attention. They heard about the 8 kings who ruled for thousands of years, about the pyramid crowned with eternal flame, about cities stretching to the horizon, and knowledge encompassing the movements of the stars. They believed him. How could they not? Ziusudra lived for 900 years after the flood, an impossible span by later standards, but a pale shadow of true immortality. His blood, carrying traces of his father's divine heritage, kept him alive long enough to see his children's children's children grow old and die. But with each generation, the details grew hazier. The second generation asked, "Did the kings really live for tens of thousands of years, grandfather, or is that symbolic?" The third generation said, "The pyramid of fire must have been a metaphor, yes, for the sun, for enlightenment." By the fourth generation, many were saying, "The old man's mind has fractured. These numbers cannot be real. No being lives so long, no flame burns forever." Ziusudra watched the truth dissolve into legend, helpless to stop it. Human lifespans were shortening with each generation. 900 years became 800, then 600, then 400. The hybrid vigor allowing post-flood survivors to live for centuries was diluting, fading, as if humanity's very biology was being downgraded to match their reduced circumstances. Kingship, when it finally re-emerged in the new civilizations rising from the silt, was mortal. Kings reigned for decades, not millennia. They were crowned as young men and died as old ones. The Sumerian king list, when finally carved into clay again thousands of years later, showed the break clearly. Before the flood, Alalim 28,800 years, Al-Algar 36,000 years. After the flood, Gur 1,200 years, Nangishlishma 670 years, still long by later standards, but mortal, comprehensible, human. And with each passing generation, the memory of the 8 became more fragmented, more confused, more mythologized, until it ceased to be memory at all and became simply story. But stories are resilient things. They travel, they adapt, they survive in forms their original tellers would barely recognize. When the tribes gathered around Ziusudra's mountain, finally dispersed, driven by population growth, resource scarcity, wanderlust, they carried versions of the story with them, and as they spread across the recovering world, the tale splintered into 1,000 variations. In Egypt, the survivors settling along the Nile remembered rulers preceding the pharaohs, the Neteru, the divine kings governing for vast spans before the great inundation. The priest Manetho, writing thousands of years later, would record their reigns in numbers scholars dismissed as fantasy. 13,900 years, 11,000 years, spans echoing the original 8. In the lands becoming Israel, the memory transformed into the Nephilim, the giants walking the earth before the flood, offspring of sons of God and daughters of men. The names changed, but the core remained. Beings of mixed divine and human heritage, living impossibly long lives, wiped away by waters covering even the mountains. To the east, in the valleys where the Indus would flow, the memory became the Devas, celestial beings descending to guide humanity through ages called yugas, each spanning thousands of years. The first age, the Satya Yuga, was a time when gods and men lived together, when Dharma was perfect, when lifespans stretched for millennia. In every land, in every tongue, the same story. Immortal rulers, vast reigns, a great flood, a world reset. Different names, different details, same memory. It would take thousands of years for anyone to notice the pattern. The archaeologists came first, men and women with brushes and trowels, digging into tells and tombs, exhuming the bones of dead civilizations. In the 19th century, in the ruins of ancient libraries, they found tablets, countless tablets, and on those tablets, lists. The Sumerian king list, the Egyptian king lists, the biblical genealogies, the Hindu Puranas. Side by side, the parallels were undeniable. Before the flood, lifespans were vast. After the flood, they shortened. Kingship descended from heaven in one golden age, then became mortal. 8 rulers appeared again and again, sometimes exactly 8, sometimes 7 or 9, but always a small council of primary beings governing before the deluge. In 1922, when the Weld Blundell Prism was unearthed in Larsa and presented to the Ashmolean Museum, scholars stood before its inscribed columns and struggled to reconcile what they read with what they believed about history. 241,200 years, 8 kings. Impossible numbers recorded with mathematical precision. Allegory, they concluded, symbolic representation of astronomical cycles. But the numbers aligned too perfectly. The 3,600-year Sar appeared not just in Sumerian mathematics, but in their astronomy, their mythology, their architecture. It was not random, it was intentional. And then, in the late 20th century, satellite imaging began to pierce the sands. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beneath the deserts of southern Iraq, structures predating Sumerian cities by millennia, geometric patterns too precise for natural formations. And at the center of it all, buried under meters of sediment deposited by ancient floods, something massive. The excavations, when they finally began, moved slowly. Political instability, limited funding, the sheer scale of the endeavor. But piece by piece, the truth emerged from the sand. A ziggurat older than any pyramid, built of basalt and bronze, in ratios suggesting knowledge of principles not rediscovered until the modern era. And at its base, arranged in a perfect octagon, 8 statues, each facing a different cardinal or ordinal direction, each carved with features almost human, but not quite. The archaeologists stood before those statues and felt something their scientific training could not explain, a resonance, a recognition, as if some deep part of the human psyche remembered what the conscious mind had forgotten. And when they finally reached the summit, when they cleared away the last millennia of sand and silt and debris, they found the capstone. It was cracked, fractured by forces geologists could not identify, not erosion, not earthquake, not any natural process. Deliberately shattered, as if something had struck it from within. But even broken, even after all these thousands of years, it still emitted a faint electromagnetic signature. The instruments registered it, a pulse, irregular but persistent, like a heartbeat struggling to continue, 0.00000001 hertz. Once every few years, the crystal emitted a burst of energy so faint it was barely distinguishable from background radiation, but present, measurable, real. The ziggurat was not dead, it was waiting. At night, when the excavation teams returned to their camps, some reported dreams, the same dream, experienced independently by people who had never discussed it. 8 figures standing in a circle, a pyramid crowned with fire, stars forming living patterns overhead, and a voice, not heard, but felt, saying the same thing over and over. When the stars align again, the covenant will renew. They dismissed it, of course, stress, the power of suggestion, the human mind finding patterns where none existed. But deep beneath the sand, in the chamber at the ziggurat's heart, something that had been a king named Ubaratutu remained fused to the capstone, his body perfectly preserved in the airless darkness, his hands still resting on the crystal, his eyes still open, still watching, still waiting. The flood had ended his age, but it had not ended his vigil. "This is Eridu," Alulim proclaimed, advancing from the circle, "the first endowment, the first pact, the cornerstone of all that will follow. When kingship descended from heaven, it descended here. The flame atop the ziggurat throbbed once, twice, 3 times. And with each throb, the humans sensed something shift inside themselves, a portal unlocking in their minds, the initial spark of genuine awareness. the commencement of the extended transformation from upright walking animals to beings who would one day aspire to the stars themselves. The 8 immortal kings had arrived. Their reign, spanning 241,200 years, had begun, and humanity, kneeling in the sand before entities of fire and starlight, would never remain unchanged. Time performs odd feats when gauged against immortality. A human lifespan, 70, perhaps 80 years, is a mere breath, a century, a lone season in a far longer year. But when centuries accumulate upon centuries, when millennia merge into eons, time itself starts to forfeit significance. Days grow indistinguishable from each other. Generations of mortals ascend and descend like waves against an eternal coastline. And the 8 kings did not age. In the outset, the humans who served them anticipated change. They observed their rulers intently, seeking the indicators they knew from their own existences: the silver infiltrating hair, the creases deepening around eyes, the gradual enfeebling of limbs. But those indicators never materialized. Year after year, decade after decade, the 8 stayed precisely as they had been on the night they descended from the sky. If anything, they became more luminous. Alulim still positioned at the northern temple of Eridu, and under his direction, humanity learned to quantify. He instructed them to observe the flow of water, to comprehend that rivers could be subdued, rerouted, made to serve. The first irrigation canals were not excavated by human hands alone. Alulim walked alongside the laborers, his presence softening the earth, easing the water's flow. Under his governance, the marshlands converted into gardens. Fields of barley extended toward the horizon, their golden stalks swaying in harmony with the seasons he had taught them to identify. "Water is life," he would declare, his voice resonating like a bell in calm air. But life uncontrolled drowns itself. Learn to channel, learn to guide, learn to construct. And they constructed. Al-Algar governed from Badtibira, the city of metal workers. And under his unyielding gaze, humanity uncovered fire's profounder secrets. He demonstrated how to extract copper from rock, how to forge bronze from the union of copper and tin, how to form tools that would endure generations. His temple was a site of hammers and furnaces where apprentices toiled for lifetimes to master what Al-Algar illustrated with emotion. When he contacted raw ore, it seemed to refine itself, impurities sloughing off like shed skin. "Law is structure," he instructed, his hands passing through flame without scorching. "Metal must be heated, hammered, shaped. So too must society. Without form, there is only chaos." To the east in Larak, a city now vanished to time and sand. Enmenluana oversaw the emergence of writing. The first symbols were not incised into clay tablets, but traced in the air by his glowing fingers, patterns of light that persisted for heartbeats before dissolving. The scribes learned to replicate what he displayed, impressing wedges into soft clay, converting thought into lasting form. With writing came recollection. With recollection came history, and with history came the dreadful realization. The kings were eternal, but humanity was not. Enmengalana founded the first courts in Sipar, where justice was administered not by force, but by calibrated judgment. He devised laws, not mere tribal habits, but intricate codes that foresaw disputes before they emerged. Under his guidance, humanity learned that truth could be ascertained, that conflicts could be settled without violence, that order could arise from discord. But his justice was unyielding, and unyielding justice, the mortals discovered, could seem harsh. Dumuzid introduced medicine to the cities, teaching the concoction of herbs, the mending of bones, the remedy of fevers. He comprehended the body in manners that appeared impossible, as if he could peer through flesh to the mechanisms beneath. Under his mentorship, healers learned that life could be prolonged, suffering lessened, death occasionally deferred, but never vanquished. Ensipadsidana bestowed astronomy upon them. He taught them to interpret the stars not as haphazard lights, but as a calendar inscribed across the heavens. The motions of celestial bodies forecasted floods, denoted seasons, quantified years. The priests he educated could predict eclipses generations ahead, could trace the roaming planets, could name every visible star, and all those stars, they realized, formed patterns that corresponded to the positions of the 8 kings around the ziggurat. As above, so below. Enmenurana disclosed the principles of architecture. Not simple mud brick edifices, but buildings crafted with mathematical exactitude, temples that directed energy, ziggurats that stretched toward the heavens. Under his tutelage, humanity erected monuments that defied their rudimentary tools, structures so impeccably aligned that modern engineers would find replication challenging. And Ubaratutu, the youngest of the 8, taught them the most valuable gift of all, preservation. How to store grain against scarcity, how to document knowledge for future generations, how to sustain what had been erected, to guard against entropy and decay. Everything ends, he would say softly, his eyes mirroring depths the others lacked. But endings can be delayed. Memory can endure the passing of those who remember. Even then, he seemed to possess knowledge the others did not. The centuries amassed like sediment layers, and still the 8 did not age. But their immortality revealed itself in ways that grew increasingly evident, increasingly alien. Their skin started to radiate a faint glow in darkness, a gentle luminescence that intensified as centuries turned to millennia. In direct sunlight, they appeared almost transparent, as if light traversed them rather than reflecting from their surfaces. Priests who lingered too near reported sensing warmth emanating from their bodies, a heat unrelated to temperature and entirely linked to energy, and when they were injured, rare mishaps during exhibitions or building, they did not bleed red. Their blood was gold, liquid gold, warm and thick, that dried into metallic powder and left marks that never fully cleansed. The first time a mortal beheld this, when Dumuzid sliced his palm while demonstrating surgery, the observer dropped to his knees in terrified adoration. "You are not kings," the mortal murmured. "You are gods." Dumuzid had regarded his golden palm, observing the wound seal without trace, and something crossed his face, an expression the mortal could not interpret. "No," he said softly, "we are not." But the distinction ceased to matter. The mortals constructed shrines. Small at first, corners of rooms reserved with offerings of grain and bronze, then larger edifices, then temples that competed with the king's own abodes. They devised rituals, prayers, ceremonies. They assigned the 8 new titles, epithets that evoked divinity: Alulim the Eternal, Alalgar the Unyielding, Enmenluana the Illuminator. The 8 did not promote this veneration, but they did not halt it either. And as the veneration expanded, something else began to expand alongside it: distance. The initial murmurs of dissatisfaction did not originate from the mortals, but from the immortals themselves. In the council chamber beneath the ziggurat, where the 8 assembled when the stars aligned, voices started to elevate in discord, not furious, not yet, but tense, bearing the burden of divergences that had solidified over millennia. "They demand more," Enmenluana said during one such assembly, his luminous form pacing the chamber's edge. "Knowledge of the profounder sciences, the fundamentals behind the flame, the mathematics of the stars, beyond what we've revealed." "And you wish to grant it to them?" Alalgar responded, his voice flat as hammered bronze. "To bestow power they cannot command." "How will they master command if we never provide the chance to exercise it? How will anything endure if we grant them the power to annihilate themselves?" The discussion was ancient as the rain itself, but it was sharpening with each passing century. Some of the 8 viewed humanity's progress as the objective of their presence. Others saw it as a peril that must be meticulously controlled. and the longer they governed, the more ingrained each stance became. Dumuzid, who had preserved countless mortal lives, spoke gently. "We are observing them perish. Every generation we observe them perish. Perhaps if we imparted more, if we bestowed the gift of prolonged life." "No." Ubaratutu's voice sliced through the chamber with unforeseen strength. The youngest of the 8 seldom spoke in council, but when he did, the others heeded. "Some gifts turn into curses. Some knowledge brings only anguish. We must be cautious what we leave behind." "Leave behind?" And Mengalana turned abruptly. "You speak as if our reign will conclude." Silence descended across the chamber. Outside, the eternal flame throbbed against the night sky. Inside, 8 immortal beings regarded one another, and for the first time in their extended existence, uncertainty flickered among them. "Everything ends," Ubaratutu reiterated, echoing the lesson he had taught mortals for millennia, even us, perhaps especially us. The flame atop the ziggurat wavered just once, just for a heartbeat, but all 8 felt it. A brief interruption in the energy flow from the stars, a warning or a pledge. Outside, the mortals slumbered serenely, secure in the conviction that their gods were eternal, unchanging, forever benevolent. Inside, the 8 kings gazed at each other across a widening chasm of millennia and conflicting philosophies, and pondered if immortality was a boon they had received or a penalty they were enduring. The reign persisted, but beneath the facade of eternal governance, fissures had started to emerge. Of all the marvels the 8 kings delivered to earth, none exceeded the ziggurat of Eridu. Not in magnitude, the pyramids that would rise millennia later in Egypt would dwarf it. Not in splendor, the hanging gardens and golden temples of Babylon would surpass its material riches. But in function, in the sheer boldness of what it was engineered to achieve, nothing humanity would ever construct would approach it. It was not simply a temple, it was a conduit. The erection had taken 7 nights, or so the legends asserted. But the truth, conserved in fragments by priest astronomers who observed it, spoke of something more elaborate. The physical edifice rose in 7 nights. The activation required 7,000 years. The base was established first, not on sand, but on bedrock, revealed by channels the kings themselves incised through sediment layers. Massive basalt blocks, volcanic stone drawn from mountains hundreds of miles away, were arranged in a pattern that corresponded to no architectural custom, because no custom yet existed. Each block was inscribed with symbols predating cuneiform, a mathematical dialect that described forces rather than items, relationships rather than entities. Bronze followed. Not the rough alloy that early smiths created, but a purified compound blended with elements that would not be separated by human science for thousands of years. The bronze was poured into grooves carved into the basalt, forming a web of conductive roots that wove through the foundation like veins through vital tissue. Each layer, Enmenurana explained to the master builders who would sustain the structure, corresponds to a sphere of heaven. The ziggurat ascended in 7 tiers, each smaller than the one beneath, producing the characteristic stepped silhouette that would characterize sacred architecture for millennia. But the tiers were not random. The first symbolized the domain of earth and water, the material plane. The second, air and storm, the atmosphere's breath. The third, fire and energy, the transformative powers. The fourth, the frontier of mortality, where earth encountered sky. The 5th tier indicated the onset of the celestial domains, the sphere of the wandering stars, the planets that traverse the fixed cosmos. The 6th was the realm of the fixed stars themselves, the eternal constellations that denoted the seasons and quantified the grand cycles of time. And the 7th, the summit, represented the void beyond, the dark waters of space through which the Anunnaki had journeyed to this world. At the pinnacle of the 7th tier, the 8 installed the capstone, the crystal matrix, that would function as the focus for forces beyond human grasp. It was not hewn from any terrestrial stone. Some narratives describe it as imported from the sky, a shard of their remote home. Others imply it was cultivated through processes that wedded technology and something akin to life. When it was positioned, when the ultimate alignment was confirmed and the final bronze strand linked, Alulim stood at the base and elevated his hands toward the heavens. The flame responded. It did not kindle from within. It descended from above, a pillar of white gold splendor that struck the capstone and anchored there, bridged between earth and stars. The light that emanated from that eternal flame was not fire, as mortals understood it. It did not consume. It required no fuel. It simply existed, a display of energy extracted from the cosmos itself and concentrated through the geometric flawlessness of the ziggurat's design. And it throbbed. The rhythm was sluggish initially, a beat like a remote heart, measured in minutes rather than seconds. But as centuries elapsed, as the edifice adapted to its role, and the bronze veins conveyed energy ever more proficiently through the basalt framework, the pulse accelerated, sinking itself to something beyond Earth's atmosphere. The flame throbbed with the stars. Priest astronomers who devoted their lives to examining the occurrence uncovered the pattern. When specific constellations ascended above the horizon, the flame intensified. When they descended, it dimmed. The 8 principal constellations encircling the ziggurat, the same patterns that aligned with the positions of the 8 kings, appeared to nourish the flame directly. Each star in each constellation a junction in an immense cosmic network. On certain nights when all 8 constellations were visible at once, when the heavenly geometry aligned with the ziggurat's geometry, something remarkable transpired. The flame became a portal. The ceremony happened once every 3,600 years, one full sar, one complete cycle of the wandering planet the Anunnaki named home. Nibiru, the crossing world, whose path carried it far beyond the visible planet's realm and then returned it sweeping through the inner solar system in a vast ellipse. When Nibiru approached, still unseen to mortal eyes but detectable by the instruments the 8 maintained, preparations commenced. 3,600 years per cycle. The orbit of Nibiru traced through the heavens by astronomers who did not yet know what they were tracking. The last alignment approximately 1,600 BCE, when the Bronze Age collapsed and civilizations fell across the Mediterranean. The next alignment approaching. And when it comes, when the stars lock into position for the first time since the judges severed the connection, the archaeologists who have uncovered the ziggurat will discover that some technologies do not die, they only sleep. Kitt Peak National Observatory, Arizona, March 15, 2023. The anomaly first appeared on Dr. Sarah Chen's screen at 3:47 a.m., a gravitational distortion in the outer solar system that shouldn't exist. She adjusted the parameters, ran the calculation again, convinced she'd made an error. But the data remained consistent. Something massive approaching from beyond the Kuiper Belt, following an elliptical orbit so elongated it defied every model of planetary formation. Orbital period approximately 3,600 years. Mass roughly 4 times that of Earth. Trajectory inbound. She sat back in her chair, her coffee growing cold, and pulled up historical astronomical records. There were gaps, of course, centuries where no one had looked at that particular region of space where the technology didn't exist to detect objects so distant and dark. But in the records that did exist, she found something that made her blood run cold. Anomalous gravitational fluctuations in 1600 BCE, again in 5200 BCE. Before that, the records were too fragmentary, but the pattern was clear. Every 3,600 years, something passed through the inner solar system, something the ancient Sumerians had called Nibiru. Dr. Chen reached for her phone with trembling hands. This discovery would rewrite textbooks. It would validate theories dismissed as pseudoscience for decades. It would also raise a question no one in the modern world was prepared to answer. If the planet was real, what else from the ancient texts might be real as well? The expedition had been drilling for 3 days when they broke through into the chamber. Dr. Hassan Rashid stood at the edge of the excavation pit, staring down at what ground-penetrating radar had promised was there, but no one truly believed. A hollow space beneath the ziggurat, 30 meters below the surface, sealed and undisturbed for millennia. "We're going in," he announced, though his voice carried none of the excitement such a declaration should hold, only apprehension. The descent took an hour, safety protocols, equipment checks, air quality readings. But finally, Hassan stood in the chamber itself, his headlamp cutting through darkness absolute, since before the pyramids rose in Egypt. The walls were bronze, not bronze plating over stone, but solid bronze, walls 3 feet thick, inscribed with symbols predating cuneiform. The floor was basalt, polished to mirror smoothness, and at the center, raised on a dais of concentric circles, stood a pillar of crystal, fractured but still intact. Even through the cracks, it glowed, faint, barely perceptible. But his instruments confirmed it. The crystal was emitting energy. After all these thousands of years, after the flood that buried it, after the ages that forgot it, the heart of the ziggurat still held a spark. "My God," whispered his assistant, who had followed him down, "it's still active." Hassan approached slowly, reverently, the way one might approach something holy. He extended his hand toward the crystal, and even before touching it, he felt warmth radiating from its surface, not the warmth of geothermal heat, but something else, something that resonated in his chest, his bones, his DNA. The moment his fingers made contact, every instrument in the chamber spiked into the red. And somewhere above them, in the desert night, the stars began to move. The calls came simultaneously from Chile, Hawaii, South Africa, Australia, astronomers staring at their screens, watching something impossible unfold in real time. The constellations were shifting, not with the slow, predictable precession occurring over millennia, not with the apparent movement caused by Earth's rotation, but actually physically shifting. Stars displacing from their recorded positions by fractions of degrees in minutes. The 8 primary constellations surrounding the ecliptic were moving into a formation unseen since ancient times, a geometric pattern matching perfectly the arrangement of statues around the ziggurat of Eridu. Dr. Chen, who had gone without sleep for 72 hours, pulled up the Sumerian astronomical tablets digitized from the British Museum's collection. She overlaid them onto the current star map. Perfect alignment. "It's happening," she whispered to her empty office. "Whatever they were waiting for, it's happening now." Hassan and his team had been ordered to evacuate. The Iraqi Ministry of Antiquities, in conjunction with the UN Archaeological Oversight Committee, had declared the site unstable, potentially dangerous. Seismic activity had increased in the region, tremors with no identifiable source, registering on instruments but not felt by human senses. But Hassan had refused to leave. He stood now on the summit of the excavated ziggurat, watching the sky with the kind of awe and terror ancient peoples must have felt witnessing eclipses or comets. The stars were burning brighter. The 8 constellations blazed with intensity that shouldn't be possible, stars millions of light years distant, somehow responding to an alignment in this solar system, in this moment. And beneath his feet the ziggurat began to hum. It started as a vibration too low to hear, registered only as trembling in the stone. But it built, frequency rising, until it became audible, a tone resonating in the chest cavity, making teeth ache and eyes water. The bronze veins threading through the basalt began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the hum. The 8 statues ringing the structure, motionless for thousands of years, began to tremble. Dust and sand cascaded from their surfaces, revealing details erosion had concealed. Faces not quite human, eyes holding depths no chisel could carve. And at the summit, where the capstone had lain fractured and dark, light began to gather, not fire, not plasma, but something existing at the boundary between energy and consciousness, a brilliance that seemed to think, to remember, to recognize its time had come again. The flame of Eridu was awakening. Hassan fell to his knees, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. His rational mind, trained in archaeology and scientific method, struggled to process what his eyes reported. But some deeper part of him, the part carrying genetic memory from ancestors who had knelt before these same forces, understood. The gods were returning. In the sealed darkness beneath the ziggurat, in the chamber where Ubaratutu had kept his vigil for millennia, change occurred. The crystal he clutched pulsed with increasing intensity. The bronze walls reflected and amplified the light, and the body remaining perfectly preserved through ages beyond counting began to warm. Gold flowed through dormant veins. Lungs that had not drawn breath since the flood's ending expanded. Eyes open but unseeing for 12,000 years began to focus. Ubaratutu, last of the 8 immortal kings, stirred. His first thought, crystallizing after so long in suspension, was simple. The alignment has returned. The covenant renews. The cycle continues. His second thought was a question. Will they be ready? The flame burst from the capstone with a roar shaking the atmosphere, not the white gold column of the ancient age, but something fiercer, something matured through millennia of waiting. A pillar of light punching through the sky, visible from orbit, announcing to whatever approached from beyond the stars that Earth remembered. Hassan shielded his eyes, backing away from the intensity. Around the ziggurat, the 8 statues had turned on their bases, impossible given each weighed tons and was rooted into bedrock, their faces now directed upward toward the sky, toward the approaching dawn. No, not toward the dawn, toward something else, something moving through the light of the rising sun, visible now even to naked eyes, a dark sphere, massive, its surface reflecting no light, noticeable only because of the stars it eclipsed as it moved. Nibiru, the crossing world, the home of the Anunnaki. And from observatories around the world, from satellites and space stations, from amateur astronomers and government installations, the same message began to transmit. Unidentified celestial body entering inner solar system, trajectory stable. Estimated approach to Earth orbit, 7 years. 7 years, the same span given before the flood, the same warning period, the same interval between announcement and arrival. Hassan stood on the ancient ziggurat, between the trembling statues, beneath a flame connecting earth to heaven, and understood with terrible clarity that history was not merely repeating, it was resuming. When kingship descended from heaven the first time, humanity had been primitive, ready to be shaped, eager to learn. Now humanity had cities rivaling anything the 8 had built, technology approaching what the Anunnaki possessed, nuclear weapons and satellites and artificial intelligence and genetic engineering. Now humanity was no longer a species waiting to be elevated. Now humanity was a rival. The flame roared brighter, and somewhere in the depths below, something ancient opened its eyes fully and began to rise. In laboratories and observatories, in government war rooms and university lecture halls, in homes around the world where people looked up at a sky suddenly feeling closer, more threatening than ever, the same question began to circulate. What happens when gods return to find their children have grown up? But there was another question, older, more fundamental, whispered first by ancient scribes and now echoing through the digital networks of a connected world. When kingship descends again from heaven, will we recognize it? Will we worship it? Or will we at long last defy it? The flame burned on, awaiting an answer that only time and the approaching darkness in the sky would reveal.